Excellencies, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to see all of you here on this wintry Geneva day. Today, we are going to start our 18th Geneva Security Debate on breaking the stalemate to find peace, the Russia-Ukraine war. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Christina Schori-Liang. I head the counterterrorism and PVE work here at the GCSP within the Research and Policy Advice Department. I'm also an adjunct faculty member of the Paris School of International Affairs, Sciences Po. Let me now pass the floor to Ambassador Thomas Greminger, Swiss diplomat and director of the Geneva Centre for Security Policy, former Secretary General of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, who has been orchestrating and facilitating numerous dialogue events across the globe to encourage communication, open dialogue, and to explore potential solutions for a ceasefire. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Christina, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's Geneva Security Debate. And as Christina has indicated, it's the 18th edition of this series. And I think that is a clear indicator of the Geneva Security Debate having become a firmly established event in international Geneva. If you join us for the first time for one of these Geneva Security Debates, just allow me to give you very briefly some background on what we intend to do with these debates. The Geneva Security Debates are public discussions which explore pressing and current security challenges, more or less on a monthly basis. We bring together leading thinkers, experts, policymakers for an interactive discussion on a specific challenge. In the short term, we hope that these debates will help inform, provide new insights, stimulate joint reflections, and create networks among policymakers and experts here in Geneva, but also beyond. And in the long term, we are more ambitious. We hope that these debates will allow us to shape a better and more secure global future. Now, one of the most central issues shaping the future of global security, of course, is Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine, which now appears poised to enter its third year in early 2024. When we look at the battlefield, we see only minimal gains by offensive operations of both sides in recent months, basically since late fall of last year. The war of attrition that we are witnessing reminds not only historians among us of the battles of World War I, fought at, for instance, Verdun or at the Somme. Are we only at a momentary standstill of the battle, or have we arrived at a more permanent stalemate? I'm interested to hear our panelists' assessment of this question. There are many that have more doubts about the future of Western support for Ukraine. I must admit that I'm personally not in that camp. I still perceive a strong solidarity of the political West for Ukraine, and I don't see that changing soon. I would admit, though, that if there is a return of Trump to the White House, that this would make matters more complicated. Then there is the Israel-Hamas war. For its part, raises a number of questions. One, to what extent, is the US ready to back two war efforts at once? But it also raises an issue of the perceived consistency of Western foreign policy in the world, the issue of double standards, as well as the necessity of working with other powers to solve regional conflict. Back to the war in Ukraine. Many of us are still reluctant to recommend the Ukrainian government to return to the negotiation table because it would, at least in the short to medium term, potentially reward the aggressor by freezing the conflict and give, at least temporarily, control over the occupied territory. At the same time, what is the alternative? The alternative is the long war, and this alternative doesn't seem to be in anybody's real interest either. Is there a way out of this dilemma? Again, I'm very keen to hear our panelists' views. And this is the point where I should thank our three panelists for being with us today. Zach Pagan, Alexander Schali, and Graham Hurd. Graham Hurd, as I just learned, got snowed in. He lives in a strange part of the world where they have difficulties in coping with snow. But they also got a lot. So, but he's with us online, I was told. So I think we are looking forward to a great debate by absolutely outstanding panelists. And without further ado, I would like to pass the floor back to my colleague, Christina Schori-Liang, to properly introduce the speakers. Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for those very, very good opening remarks. Today, as we are kicking off the 18th GSD, let me first describe the focus of the debate today. Today, we're going to discover the importance of Russian strategic behavior and what it means for the West in general and Ukraine in particular. In part, we will talk about Russian strategic culture from the Tsarist times until the invasion of Ukraine. We will then focus on Putin's Russia and how he sees the world. We will also discuss different scenarios on how to move forward from the current stalemate in the war, in brokering different ceasefire scenarios. And to help us on this journey, we have two academics and an ambassador to give us his insights. So let me first begin with our ambassador. Ambassador Alexander Chali is currently an associate fellow at the GCSP, a former high-ranking diplomat in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. He has over 45 years of experience in diplomacy, leadership, and law. He has been working as an educator and advisor in the public and private sectors of Ukraine. Dr. Zachary Pagan is a senior researcher in our International Security Dialogue Department at the GCSP and a research fellow in Grand Strategy at Quincy Institute, which is responsible, Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington, D.C. He is also a senior fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and co-editor of a recent volume, Rebooting Global International Society, Change, Contestation, and Resilience, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan. Dr. Graham Hurd, who is joining us virtually from snowed-in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, which is home to the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies. Dr. Graham Hurd joined the Marshall Center in January 2015. He is a professor of transnational security studies in the Research and Policy Analysis Department. He runs a monthly virtual seminar series examining Russian crisis behavior and Russia-China nexus, and the implications for the United States, Germany, friends, and allies. He was also a faculty member here at the GCSP from 2005 to 2013. He and I and Ambassador Thomas Greminger were recently actually at the Munich Security Conference, where we with Harvard University conducted a tabletop exercise on mapping preconditions for a ceasefire agreement in Ukraine. So we do collaborate a lot. In 2022, Dr. Graham Hurd published a book entitled Understanding Russian Strategic Behavior and Imperial Strategic Culture and Putin's Operational Code. The book offers readers a better understanding of Russian strategic culture and thinking. It is essential reading for those who are interested in understanding the roots of Russian foreign security policy. I highly recommend it. It is very concise, but also very substantive. Now, to the questions of the debate. Dr. Graham Hurd, you are first in line. You wrote your book in late 2022, just a couple of months before the Russia's dawn invasion of Ukraine on February 24th. Did the invasion of Ukraine underscore Russia's imperial strategic culture and behavior? And has it solidified your thinking of Putin's operational code, or has your thinking changed? Could you also describe to us whether the West has a Putin problem or a Russia problem? I believe you also prepared a slide for us. I have distributed for everyone so they can also see it here in the audience. And those who are with us online will be able to see it online. So please discuss for us the wonderful slide that you prepared for us and some of the takeaways from your fabulous book. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Christina. My apologies for not being with you. As Ambassador Greminger said, I come from a strange part of the world, that is Germany. I can say that because my wife is German, so I can fully understand. And I'm delighted a Swiss diplomat is so undiplomatic to say that Germany is strange. I quite agree with you, Ambassador Greminger. I'm just joking, of course, but really sincerely, we have icy rain. The planes went flying yesterday, and train lines were down because snow hit trees and the trees came down onto the line. So yes, my book is 105,000 words, published in January 2022. And then once I'd published it, I realized that actually that slide would have saved me writing 105,000 words, and anyone that's foolish enough to buy it and read it from reading it. Essentially, the argument was exactly the question was, do we have a Putin problem or a Russia problem? Does it matter if Putin is president? Do presidents really matter? It's all about strategic culture, national interests that are enduring. And a president, any given president, is essentially a handmaiden of the elite, a puppet in a sense, and they kind of go with the flow. So Russia's a great power. It will typically behave as a great power, and what we see under Putin is what we would see under any Russian president. So I try to challenge that idea. And to clarify the thinking then, you can see three columns: structural factors. This is Russia's deep history, if you like, the lessons that any given regime draw from that history regarding threats and challenges, and how what is kind of normal behavior in terms of using coercive force to address those threats and challenges. That is the essence of a strategic culture. And so what I argued, I think, in the book was that Russia's strategic and political culture is imperial, and it shapes broad national interest as understood by elites and societies. Russia claims 1,000-year history, so this is why it's a deep history. It appropriates Kievan Rus as part of Russian history. It's a linear from 8th century really through to Putin in 2023. It's one linear continuity, no ruptures really. You might think 1917 would be, but no ruptures. It's one continuous history, and it sets then these national goals. The function of the regime, any given regime, is to interpret then history and to explain the historical lessons to the contemporary population over which that regime or power elite governs. So Putin's been in power since, well, really late 1999, let's say, but say 2000, first-term presidency. He goes through to having changed the constitution to stand for the first time next year for president until under the present constitution 2036, when he will then be 86, being 72 years now. So the regime really does two things. It uses control of state institutions like the media or the legal system or the education system or the Russian Orthodox Church to interpret, inculcate a narrative about the past that justifies contemporary policy, and also with control of the law, legal system, enforce interpretations of that particular narrative. And then you have a given regime, which is Putin's regime, but the leadership within it is interesting to look at. So the regime can include the normative state, that is all of the ministries, the bureaucracy, the elite, members of United Russia Party, but they're not the people making the decisions. It's really Putin using the National Security Council, or Russian Security Council rather, as a sounding board, but he and a small group making core strategic decisions, for example, annexation of Crimea or full-scale multi-axis attack on Russia. And here the argument is presidents do matter because they essentially choose the means to achieve the broad ends which the given regime has interpreted. They have their own threat perception or risk calculus. They can deliberate different courses of action, put different courses of action on the table, and then make choices. And so when you take this operational code argument, you have to say, well, what are the beliefs of any given leadership? And here you can break the beliefs into two sets. One is philosophical beliefs. How does the regime see the world? And secondly, on the basis of how the regime sees the world, how does the regime react to that world as the regime sees it? So in short then, structure sets goals, regime interprets and justifies security policy in pursuit of those goals, and the decision makers choose the means to achieve those particular goals. So any Russian president would want Russia to be a great power, for example. You could also say any Russian president would want influence on Ukraine. Yeltsin chooses to recognize Ukrainian independence. Putin chooses annexation, subversion in 2014 of Crimea and then in Donbass, and then full-scale multi-axis attack in 24th of February 2022. To give another example, any Russian president, I think, would want a Russian voice and veto in global hotspots. But President Medvedev, for example, in April 2010, didn't intervene in Osh and Jalalabad in southern Kyrgyzstan to separate Kyrgyz from Uzbek populations, abstained from UN Security Council 1973 when it came to Libya. By contrast, in September 2015, for example, President Putin sent an armed expeditionary group to Syria outside the 400-year-old historic empire to carry out expeditionary and coalitional warfare for the first time in Syria. So, in other words, different presidents can choose different means to achieve the ends. And when I reflect on this schema for, what change and what continuity have we seen, very briefly, I would say that the war, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine starting 24th, or the continuation war essentially, on the 24th of February 2022, has reinforced Russian ideas of their own political and strategic culture. In effect, the direction of travel hasn't changed. It's maybe accelerated and intensified under the pressure of the war. Russia's doubling down on its interpretation of the past. I mean, the most recent example is Alexander Nevsky and the Golden Horde. That Nevsky, Kievan prince, grand prince, in 1240 goes to the Golden Horde, the Khan, pays tribute, has protection in the east, and therefore can take on the Teutonic Knights, Battle of Nieva in the west. Essentially, the argument is strategic intelligence Nevsky had allowed him to go into Swedish lines and preemptively take down the Swedish forces, just as Putin has said at a civic chamber 3rd of November this year address, just as Russia preemptively attacks Ukraine in 2022 to stop NATO coming in, and that Russia has freedom for maneuver against the West because the West was going to change Russian culture, values, etc. Unlike the Golden Horde, you pay them tribute and you have protection, and orthodoxy, language, etc. can survive. So that's a really interesting references to Nevsky, for example, have really taken off in Russian discourse, not just Patriarch Kirill or Lavrov, but also Putin on numerous occasions, drawing this analogy, which just shows how much Putin lives by historical metaphors and historical analogies, which aren't necessarily, he's not really stress testing the assumptions or the applicability of these analogies. So what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that the operational code, the philosophical beliefs are fundamentally unchanged. For Putin, what he's doing in Ukraine is Germany's reunification in 1990-91, or the political West at the moment stands as the Soviet Union did in 1991, ready to collapse, full of decay. These philosophical beliefs are even stronger. In terms then of the operational code, we've seen some examples of it shifting. I was very, very surprised that Putin must have green-lighted the so-called regrouping of 20,000 Russian soldiers from Kherson in November 2022 to the left bank of the Dnieper River. There he faced, the choice was lose a regional capital, Kherson City, in an oblast that you claimed in a false referendum, 30th of September, is Russian territory, built in under the constitutional changes into Russia proper, or have 20,000 troops annihilated. And here Putin went with the pragmatic military logic, I think, of the general staff of Surovikin at the time, who was making the case for it. But I think in terms of instrumental beliefs, you also see that Putin went into the war thinking it was a 3-day war, not a 640+ day war, and really didn't have an escalation strategy because of that, thinking it was regime decapitation, the city's full, the FSB pay off mayors, etc. The city's full, Russia takes over. And because this didn't happen, you end up with a strategy of ruin and spoliation against critical national infrastructure in Ukraine, against the cities, to try and show that Ukraine isn't economically viable. And we also see, in terms of instrumental beliefs, the issue that's becoming clearer of, Volodin said back in 2011, no Putin, no Russia, but is it the case now, no war, no Putin? In other words, to what extent is the current regime wedded to or needs a war? To put that another way, how anti-fragile is it? Is it an anti-fragile regime vulnerable to tranquility? And this is important because it goes to the theme we're looking at, which is ceasefire. Can Putin actually have a ceasefire and remain in power? What is he if he's not a kind of partial mobilization, partial war economy, special military operation president? That's a question, I think. I'll leave it there. I could say more on this, and I'm still trying to think through how to apply, for book number 2, how to apply this schema. To what extent has it really changed? To what extent do we see continuity in the philosophical and instrumental beliefs of Putin? So I'll work on that more. If any of you in the audience looking at this think, aha, Graham has missed the point, here's a better idea, please email me and I'll be glad to incorporate the ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham, for that very insightful chart and for sharing that with us. So let me now pass the floor to Ambassador Chali. How do you perceive the root causes of the conflict, and what is Ukraine's future within the European security apparatus? The floor is yours.
Dr. Herbst describes in his book and in his presentation very deeply, fundamentally, the internal mechanism of adoption Russian strategic decision. But in my diplomatic life, I met Putin personally 16 times, and I negotiated practically all critical and strategic Ukrainian-Russian bilateral agreements. Last time, it was very close group dialogue in Kremlin in 2008, before it was spring 2008, before the invasion to Georgia, and before the Bucharest summit of NATO, where Ukraine demanded map for NATO membership. And I tried to look at decision-making of Putin from external environment, because he adopts his decision not in vacuum. He adopts his decision under some external behavior of another states. And to my mind, when I try to answer on your first question, what are the roots of Ukrainian war, not conflict, but war in Ukraine. To my mind, this is key roots are determined by, firstly, geopolitics, namely the hard confrontation between the United States and Russia over Ukraine. This is what becomes the main trigger, as to me, for full-scale Russian aggression against Ukraine in 2022. Second root is geoeconomics, namely the hard confrontation between the EU and Russia over Ukraine. This was the key trigger for the Russian illegal annexation of Crimea and the start of the proxy war in Donbass in 2014. And thirdly, Ukraine's strong desire to become member of European family, the European choice of Ukrainian nation, the desire of Ukraine to become member of NATO and the EU. This was the key trigger for Ukrainian Orange Revolution in 2004. Another question, I think it's a very important strategic question, was Russia's aggression against Ukraine inevitable? I am sure not. The European cooperative system, security system, based on Helsinki Act and Paris Charter, gave NATO, Ukraine, EU, and Russia enough tools to diplomatically resolve all contradictions between them. But Putin committed a crime. He began in 2014 and then in 2024 direct aggression against Ukraine. In my opinion, what Putin did is very well described by Foucher's famous expression. This is more than a crime, it's a mistake. Putin became a victim of his own propaganda and his intelligence services. And to my mind, very quickly after invasion in 24 of February last year, he very quickly understood his historical mistake. And I was in that moment in the group of Ukrainian negotiators. We negotiate with Russian delegation practically 2 months, in March and April, the possible peaceful settlement agreement between Ukraine and Russia. And we, as you remember, concluded so-called Istanbul communique. And we were very close in the middle of April, in the end of April, to finalize our war with some peaceful settlement. For some reasons, it was postponed. But to my mind, Putin, this is my personal view, Putin in 1 week after started his aggression in 24 February last year, very quickly understood he did mistake and tried to do everything possible to conclude agreement with Ukraine. And Istanbul communique, it was his personal decision to accept the text of this communique, which totally far away from the initial proposal of Russia, ultimatum proposal of Russia, which they put before the Ukrainian delegation in Minsk. So we managed to find a very real compromise. So Putin really wanted to reach some peaceful settlement with Ukraine. It's very important to remember. As for the future place of Ukraine in the European security architecture, To my mind, it first of all depends on the strategic decision of NATO member states to accept Ukraine as a member of the organization. It's a crucial question now for Ukrainian security. If this does not happen, then in my opinion, for a long period of time, Ukraine will be a fortress state, a key tool for deterring Russia on the eastern flank of NATO and in the heart of Europe. But to my mind, it's not excluded that in the distant future, Ukraine may become a bridge state between NATO and new democratic Russia. But the best solution now for my country, and which now are supported overwhelming majority of Ukrainian population, up to 90%, to become member of NATO as soon as possible. So for us, a new strategic challenge, this is next NATO summit in Washington this summer. And we expect that it will be adopted some historical decision and we receive invitation to be member of this organization. So it will be answered to all our security concerns. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm afraid you're not off the hook. I have one more question for you. What communication channel can be established to foster trust and understanding between the conflicting parties in particular and between international security actors such as the EU and NATO in general?
Look, in your questions, you make a distinctions between conflicting parties, namely Ukraine and Russia, and international security actors, namely EU and NATO. But as follows from my previous answer, I have a different point of view. Firstly, I believe that today we are witnessing not a conflict between Ukraine and Russia, but a full-scale hot war between them. So I, as you see, try to change the word conflict to word war. For us, it's very important. Secondly, that the Ukrainian-Russian hot war is an integral part of a full-scale Cold War between the collective West and Russia over Ukraine. In other words, NATO and EU are not international security actors, something neutral parties, but real participants in the Cold War with Russia over Ukraine. It's my strong belief. Based on this, I believe that until we resume communication channels and a certain level of mutual understandings between the collective West and Russia, we will not be able to restore trust between Ukraine and Russia. So to my mind, we have to focus on establishing some dialogue concerning Ukraine or even other matters. If it will be some even small achievements in strategic stability dialogue between Russia and United States, it will be good for Ukraine. It's my personal perception. And now, as you know, Ukrainian President Zelensky has no trust to Putin. And proof of this, Zelensky adopted special decree prohibited any negotiation on the issue of war and peace with Putin. But in general, I am convinced that the key action in ending the war in Ukraine must first of all be taken by the collective West, but not Ukraine. It's a strategic view, because now the West, and first of all, United States, Germany, France, in very special position. We're far away, and we are ready to do what you ask. But when I directly ask some decision maker who now in Ministry of Foreign Affairs of United States, German, France, if in 3 months, President Zelensky asks you, together with us, as independent partners, to start some negotiations with Russia on ceasefire, I will be ready to participate. You know, the first reaction, no, this is your war. But then I ask them, look, boys, but you promise us to do what we ask. And after this, silence. So to me, because it's very popular slogan, the key to stop this war in Moscow. But I agree, but key is to stop of this war also in Washington, Berlin, Brussels, and Paris. And in Kyiv also.
Thank you so much. I am now going to pass the floor to Dr. Zachary Paitkin. Zachary, as someone who has studied grand strategy and Russian foreign policy, what are the elements that contribute to President Putin's risk calculations, and how can President Putin's red lines be discerned?
Well, thanks very much, Christina, for inviting me to be on the panel today. I think your question is an important one because it assumes that Russia has red lines and still has red lines. And I think it's been an unfortunate tendency in many Western political circles and public discourse circles over the past nearly 2 years now, effectively to insist that Russia does not have red lines, that this is a Potemkin foreign policy, a Potemkin military, a Potemkin regime, and all you have to do is prod it a little bit, touch it a little bit, and the whole edifice will effectively collapse. I think that that's been an unfortunate position. It's a risky one, thankfully one that the mainstream political establishment in the West, by and large, has not adopted, but nonetheless a dangerous discourse. Just because red lines shift and are capable of shifting doesn't mean that they don't exist. And I think it's very dangerous to get into a game of basically only discovering where the red lines are after we've already transgressed them. Especially because, and you mentioned Putin's risk calculations, we have seen so far in the duration of this conflict that he is someone who is willing to take certain risks. If we want to look for evidence of that, all we have to do is to look at the fall of 2022, when the Ukrainian forces made substantial gains in the Kharkiv and Kherson regions, and the response of Putin was to double down and not to back down. Instead, he launched a partial military mobilization, and he annexed these 4 Ukrainian regions. So I think that this should really give us pause about the notion that we can coax Putin to the table through coercive means alone. I think thus far, the approach that the Biden administration has taken to establishing precisely where Russia's shifting red lines lie has been a wise one. It has been through probing the existence of those lines, through a gradual increase of military assistance to the Ukrainian armed forces, in a fashion that does not, and has not, at least to date, led to specific forms of escalation. But I caution again that just because it has to date not led to escalation does not mean that we can draw that line linearly out into the future. So I think we should very much keep that in mind as well. The gradual increase of the type of military equipment that we've been willing to provide has been a way of preventing escalation. But the implication of that, of course, is that Ukraine has ended up with a time frame of receiving weapons that have allowed it not to lose this war, but also not to win the war fully. So that comes with implications for us as well. And the issue now is that Russia does believe that time is on its side as a result of Ukraine's most recent failed counteroffensive. It has imposed red lines in the past. We only have to look at the intervention in Georgia in 2008, the annexation of Crimea in 2014. What Putin was trying to do with those actions, I contend, is sort of to take certain options for the West off the table, basically to say that NATO membership for these countries is not possible. And by taking options off the table, it should facilitate a future negotiation by clarifying the scope, effectively, of what is and is not achievable in Russia-West relations. And perhaps if we were to adopt something similar in our approach, basically to take off the option for Russia of fully subjugating Ukraine, to take that off the table, to make it clear that the Russians are not going back to Kiev, etc. That would be a useful means of establishing firmly where the red lines are on both sides. I think just the question is, how far are we prepared to go at that point to ensure the question of Ukraine's security, how credible actually our commitment is going to be based on our reluctance to offer such commitments in the past, and whether we can communicate actually clearly what we are prepared to do and what we're prepared not to do in the defense of Ukraine.
Thank you so much. As Russia is stepping up its global engagement and is increasing its influence in Asia and Africa and elsewhere, what steps can the West take to align its own strategic objectives with those of Russia?
Well, I'm not sure if Russia is increasing its influence right now in the world. I mean, certainly not in Europe, where the strategic landscape it faces now is far less favorable to its interests than that before the 24th of February 2022. Nor in the Middle East, where Russia was able to mount more of a balancing act as a regional great power between Israel and Iran and other actors, and it's increasingly losing that ability since the start of the Israel-Hamas war. Excessive dependence on China as well is not something that indicates Russia's increased influence. So I'm not sure if I agree necessarily with the premise that Russia's influence is increasing, nor with the notion that we can really align our strategic objectives with there at the present time and over the short term. I think we're probably in a situation right now where the best we can hope for is to manage the risk of escalation, and that is a very serious task. It's going to require a desire to have much more significant dialogue than we currently have, and not just in the context of the Ukraine war, but also in the case of the Middle East, for example, where the risk of a regional conflict remains, and the Russians who retain forces in places like Syria could be dragged into this, whether they like it or not, especially because they're increasingly relegated to one side of the regional conflict as opposed to being able to play all sides. So I think we need to, keep those lines of communication open so that we can basically game out what scenarios might play out, and that's a significant policy achievement in and of itself. Over the long term, we can have a deeper conversation about whether or not it's possible to transcend sort of this friend-foe binary with Russia and think of what kind of balance in a multipolar world might be strategically favorable on at least certain issues to both the U.S. and Russia at the same time. And people like Tom Graham at the CFR have written about that quite eloquently. But I think we're still a while away from that.
And I think Graham will also shed light on what we just spoke about in terms of can we align our strategic objectives with those of Russia? You mentioned in your book that President Putin is interested in making Russia great again. And you specified in your book that according to the Putinite mindset, there's been an encroachment upon Russia, and it has taken many forms, including an ideational context in which the West would instrumentalize its political systems to undermine, weaken, and ultimately control Russia. You mentioned democracy, rule of law, and human rights are contemporary tools of Western power that Russia should resist, and that NATO is the hard power backstop of soft power tools designed to enable a postmodern color revolution type coup d'etats. If Russia accepts Western constraints, limits, and controls, then Russia becomes, in President Putin's words, a colonial democracy. So instead, Russia is seeking a new sphere of influence and balance of power thinking that reflect a desire for a Vienna system projected to the global level and a Yalta-Potsdam II restoration. Could you describe what you mean by this in your book?
Sure, I will. Yeah, what I think, at least I think Russia means when it uses this kind of language. Firstly, though, just to go back to the external environment, as Ambassador Charlie said, and our both panelists, in fact, referenced it. I think from a Russian perspective, Russia does see, and from your question, Christina, Russia does see itself as encircled, and the implication of that in terms of its instrumental beliefs is that, in other words, what you do about the world as you see it is that Russia believes everything it therefore does is defensive and reactive. It's not revisionist. It's restoration of the status quo before, because it's the West that's kind of forcing it to move. And I think that's an interesting one. Also, I agree with this idea of Putin as a victim to his own propaganda. One Russian analyst said that the Kremlin is the most censored space in the world because of the lack of information feedback loops from the intelligence services, and essentially Putin looking at RT or whatever he's looking at, Russia to Russia TV station, and believing what he's seeing. And lastly, on the Istanbul communique, it was really interesting to see what that would have meant for Kharkiv Oblast, what it would have meant for Zaporozhye, Kherson, and Donetsk and Luhansk, as well as Crimea, to the administrative borders, and what kind of conditionality there was there. In other words, non-NATO Ukraine imposed neutrality, I think would have been part of that deal as it was understood in late February, March into April. So I'd be interested actually to see what that would have looked like. And I think trust between Russia and Ukraine isn't so much dependent on something the West does, it's dependent on Russian cruise missiles stopping their attacks on civilian infrastructure, attacks on cities, Russia essentially stopping its aggressive behavior on Ukrainian territory. And lastly, in terms of red lines, just to come back, I was really struck by, there are limits to Putin's behavior. Karaganov and Trenin, for example, in the summer basically said there is, because Russia has to use non-strategic nuclear weapons to restore the credibility of its strategic deterrence. In other words, underpinning their argument was red lines have been broken and Putin hasn't reacted. Engels Air Force Base, a strategic bomber base, has been attacked with drones, Sevastopol headquarters, and they could have mentioned the Donskoy submarine in dry dock, nuclear submarine, I should say, having been attacked, except it happened after the June, I think, and September. Last article, I think, was September by Karaganov, essentially saying not only should we use non-strategic nuclear weapons against Ukrainian cities, but also NATO European cities, Warsaw, London, Berlin, who knows, Tallinn, where those were. In terms of the Vienna Congress, yeah, I think, and this isn't my idea, I think it was Trenin's, actually, Dmitry Trenin, about 2016, he argued that the Vienna Congress, from a Russian perspective, and Lavrov basically argued this in his Russian history and Russian foreign policy article, March 3rd, I think, 2016, in Russia and Global Affairs, that was then put onto the website of the MFA. The basic argument is when great powers come together, they can agree the rules of the game, and when they do, you have stability. And Vienna is referenced as imposed neutrality on Belgium, spheres of influence in Europe, and stability for 99 years. The idea then is to take that notion at the European level and to put it at the global level. And here there's another Russian idea of centers of global power. So it's not European powers, it's centers of global power, which again, according to Lavrov, is Brasilia, it's Brazil, there's only 5 states, Brazil, Beijing, New Delhi, obviously Moscow and Washington. And these states have their hemispheres or their spheres, and they have an order producing a managerial role within the spheres. They come together, great powers, as a congress, essentially agree what to do about terrorism, structural interventions, or not agree on these global strategic issues, and then have the power to enforce and implement them at the local or regional level. I think that's the understanding. But more recently, and particularly since the war into Ukraine, the idea of Russia as a civilizational state has come up. So no longer quite, it's the center of global power, but it's also a civilizational state. And this is interesting in terms of the borders and boundaries of the civilization. And here, Putin's article, I think, called something like on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, I think it was June 21, July 21. He essentially, it was a near abroad doctrine, essentially saying in the Russian Ruski Mir, or civilizational state, you have allies, you have neutrals, and you have anti-Russian platform states. And it's very clear that Russia wants to eliminate anti-Russian platform states. That's the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. That would also include Moldova and I think Georgia. The neutrals would be Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and the allies, Kyrgyzstan, Belarus, obviously, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan. So this is a notion, and I think civilizational I take to mean a euphemism essentially for empire, and that's what essentially it's make the world safe for empires policy, or make empires great again, or justify the existence of civilizations or empires based on traditional values. If you go to the MFA Russian website, 30th of November, an article by the Foreign Policy Planning Department Director Alexei Drobinin called "Why is the choice of traditional values so important?" So the metropole, the Imperial Center, able to impose their understanding, in this case Russia's understanding of traditional values, in what you would call Russian space. But actually, that's the rhetoric. The reality, I think, is BRINC, Belarus, Russia, Iran, North Korea grouping. And the reality, I think, is Russia drifting into a de facto a G0 world order conception, Bremer's conception of a G0 world order, which is a group of no states controlling the strategic agenda. And here being disruptive, having a spoiler role is effective. States really without allies who see themselves as kind of in a forever war do best in these situations. And the interesting thing about that particular grouping is each of them see themselves at war with the West, as Ambassador Charlie said. The battle in Ukraine is a battle in a global war, as they would see it. And the struggle is really for multipolarity and the hearts and minds in the global South. So I think that's how I see a Russian conception, starting with Vienna, going to the global level, morphing into a civilizational state idea, but in essence, having a G0 conception of global order. And that's the order in which Russia, which only really in the military power dimension is strong, the nuclear sphere there, not even conventionally, is ahead of China. That's the world order paradigm, if you like, that I think Russia best thrives within. And it goes to the notion of an anti-fragile regime as well, does best under those circumstances, that external environment. Thank you.
Graham, thank you so much, Graham. Incredibly impressive response to a couple questions. I really, really admire your deep knowledge. So now I'm going to pass the floor to Ambassador Charlie. The war in Ukraine is fast approaching a frozen conflict with no real clarity when the fighting will end. The war in the Middle East has further intensified the debate on how to prevent Russia from increasingly riding the wave of global disruption. This was also highlighted by our director just recently. The war between Israel and Hamas has hastened the creation of macro-blocs, which are weighing and leveraging their interests among the great powers. What can be done before winter sets in to leverage the current stalemate, and what steps can be taken to create greater stability and lasting peace?
Okay. First, I answer of your very long question. I give some comments on Dr. Hert's statement. I totally agree with him that one of the strategic idea of Russians now to reach some status quo with the collective West. And they trying to do it long period of time. And the Medvedev initiative in 2008 concerning the Treaty on European Security was the complex proposal. And because of some reasons, this idea was not accepted by collective West, within OSCE especially. The Russia changed their strategy. They decided to destroy the status quo with West anywhere where for them it's possible. So it's very easy to explain their policy in Syria, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in Ukraine, and for them they Putin personally, I am sure 100%, and majority of Russian citizens, 100% sure they are great. But they need recognition. And they don't need recognition from China or from other collective South countries. They need this as recognition from collective West. It's their headache, to my mind. And from taking into the discussion, I want to answer to your questions, and I want to divide your questions for 3 questions. First of all, is the war in Ukraine fast approaching a frozen conflict? Before I start to answer on all these 3 questions, I do some small statement. I am retired ambassador. I am not represent official position of Ukraine. It's my personal position. And to my mind, yes, you are right. I personally assume that soon enough we will witness de facto ceasefire in Ukraine. Whether this ceasefire is temporary or sustainable will depend on diplomacy. And I am confident that diplomats, especially the military diplomats, will have a chance to silence the gun for a long period of time. So I'm more optimistic than pessimistic concerning the ending of hostilities in Ukraine. Second question, what can be done before winter sets in to leverage the current stalemate? My answer very clear, provide Ukraine as quickly as possible. It's my appeal to collective West, with more weapons and more finance to contain Russia. Somebody described Russia as Potemkin village, but this Potemkin village fabricate more shells than sophisticated EU. This Potemkin village managed to receive more weapons from Iran, from Northern Korea, and more quickly than we managed to receive from our strategic partners in the West. So we need from you now, especially now, it's a very critical period for us, more weapons, more finance, and more effective sanctions regime against Russia. And I believe that this is three instruments today very important to break the stalemate, to find a ceasefire. So if we will be stronger next 3 months, it will give real possibility to transfer hostilities is de facto ceasefire. I stress ceasefire, not peace, because in title of our debate, we use word peace. I'm sure 100%. Peace in Ukraine, impossible for a long, long period of time. Because as Dr. Hert mentioned, after Putin, illegal annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions, and now this is constitutional status as part of Russia territory, which is impossible to change quickly because of some constitutional procedure in Russia. Ukraine will never agree to negotiate any peace settlement, peace agreement with Russia before Russia will not change constitution. Because if we do it, we recognize in such a way that this is territory of the part of Russia. So to my mind, the only one possibility now which exists, and this is possibility is real, this is ceasefire. The question temporarily or sustainable, it depends from diplomacy. And the last your question, what steps can be taken to ensure greater stability and lasting peace? Greater stability and lasting peace can only be achieved if Russia withdraws its troops from the whole occupied Ukrainian territories, including Crimea. Today, this looks unlikely. To achieve this, diplomacy must be given a chance. In particular, I think it's possible to put forward now for discussion few ideas. For example, to hold a pan-European summit on Ukraine, or it's coincide with President Zelensky's idea of convening the global summit on his peace formula plan, and maybe to organize P5 summit on Ukraine peace settlement. Why I propose this is P5 summit? Because P5 in 1994 in Budapest gave Ukraine security guarantees for our territorial integrity and sovereignty. So to my mind, earlier or later, P5 will be in process of restoration, full sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine over occupied territories controlled now by Russians. So I think we need some new, more global idea, because on bilateral level, I stress once more, without direct involvement in any negotiation, consultations concerning the ending of hostilities in Ukraine, it will be impossible on bilateral level to reach such situation in Ukraine. This is my message.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to highlight that of course, we are really worried about the harsh winter that's coming and what this will mean and the humanitarian impact on the civilian population. We had actually a Geneva security debate exactly on that topic, the humanitarian response, especially here in Geneva and also Switzerland in particular, on that. So if you are interested, you can see that on our website. But another worry, of course, in Europe would be if Trump would be reelected after President Biden, who has actually been one of the most Europe-friendly presidents on record. He worked extra hard to dispel the bad feelings that Trump unleashed in Europe. And the big worry is, of course, if Trump wins the next US presidential election, what is the situation for NATO. He has already challenged NATO's survival. He called the EU a foe, and he might seek to turn Russia against China, as US President Nixon did China against the Soviet Union. Abandonment of Ukraine might be his bait. Is what he's saying just election talk or something more ominous? What are your views on the Russia-China nexus, and what are the implications of this for the United States and the world? Back to you, Graham.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Christina. Yes, if President Trump comes to power, he certainly has a return on investment policy towards NATO, demanding a return on investment. And I think his understanding would be, it's a European security crisis in Ukraine. Europe should take more responsibility, pay more to address that particular problem. And the guardrails, I was listening to Liz Cheney this morning saying that there will be no guardrails essentially around President Trump. And certainly he's questioned the utility of democracy. So that is a worry. But the idea of doing a reverse Nixon or Kissinger, as Kissinger would have probably said, of going to Beijing to turn Beijing against Russia, to make it a partner and to change the balance of power. So to go to Moscow and turn Putin against Xi Jinping, I think fails on a number of levels. Firstly, for Putin, Trump would be too unpredictable. So you don't want to go all in with President Trump. If Trump changes his mind, has a bad hair day, wakes up, changes his mind, and the alliance, if you like, or the friendship or the partnership between the US and Russia doesn't really live up to the unlimited friendship, or no limits rather, friendship, 4th of February 2022 that Putin had with Xi Jinping. I think another reason is Putin is too dependent. Putin is too dependent in terms of trade now with China than it is with the US. That using Ukraine somehow as bait, I'm not so sure, because Trump may abandon, inverted commas, Ukraine anyway. So why make it a quid pro quo if you're Putin to turn against China, whatever that would mean, when you're getting it essentially as a gift? So take it, bank it. And I think from Putin's perspective, it's not just the Ukraine being the issue, but he's remarkably consistent. It's also NATO being the issue. In other words, it goes to as Ambassador Charlie said, some sort of a pan-European summit is needed. So to address the Ukraine agenda, Putin can do that with Ukraine and impose neutrality, take the annex, as he's done, but to the full administrative borders of the occupied territories. But also he would say no NATO enlargement after 1997 is a condition. No forward bases, no bases foreign bases on Ukrainian territory, that's for sure. No joint exercises with foreign states. And then the European agenda as well would come in. So that, I think, makes it difficult to see Putin taking the bait, so to speak. Also, I think it fundamentally misreads Russia's reading of China. As I said, I'm not just basing it on Nevsky and the analogies with Alexander Nevsky. going in 1240 and paying tribute, and then being able to take on the West, at that time Sweden, Teutonic Knights, Battle of Nieva. But I think this fundamentally does show a Putin worldview that we suppose subordination and dependency on and junior partner status for Russia. If Russia's not with the West, or at least balancing the West against China, then it's totally dependent on China in a Chinese technology trade-centric, Sino-centric order in which it's a junior player. Russia doesn't see it like that, I don't think. It sees itself as having breathing space to take on the West. And maybe even you'll start to see in Russian articles the notion of hybrid operations being described as Tatar-Mongol raiding culture. And it's part of that, as Russia celebrates this 2 centuries under Mongol, essentially imperial rule, and the benefits of that rather than the deficits. Thank you.
Now over to you, Zachary. Donald Trump is probably Russia's favorite candidate because he is also very unpredictable. This could pose problems, but he pleases Russia. So how do you foresee the U.S.-Russian relations develop should Trump win the election?
Well, allow me just to build on what Graham just said, and I agree with the main thrust of it. I mean, China is a rising power on Russia's border. Even after Vladimir Putin leaves the Kremlin, Russia will maintain an incentive, will retain an incentive to maintain good relations with China to some degree. So there will be limits on the extent to which we can pry the two countries apart. Even under someone like Donald Trump. We can, of course, engage in certain actions over the long term to avoid pushing the two of them unnecessarily close together, but that's different from saying that some kind of reverse Kissinger is actually possible. Beyond that, I think that the chances for improvement in U.S.-Russia relations under a hypothetical Trump presidency are not as high as many people would think, and you don't have to just look at his unpredictability. I think you just have to look at the record of the administration that he had in the first term. And yes, there will be different people by his side in a hypothetical second term. But, you know, the Trump administration was not a pro-Russia administration. I mean, put the rhetoric aside and look at the actual policy. You know, this was an administration that was willing to provide lethal assistance to the Ukrainians, that was playing hardball in both INF and New START talks. To a degree, certainly as it relates to New START, that the Biden administration was not prepared to play. It was an administration that was prepared to strike Russia's ally in Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So in many respects, this was an administration that adopted a hard line against Moscow. Beyond that, you know, actually being able to restore relations with Russia necessitates an approach to diplomacy that I don't think that Donald Trump is capable of doing, or that he even necessarily has the interest in. I mean, you know, he's going to have to find some sort of way to rally allies in Europe behind some kind of settlement to the Ukrainian war, some kind of ceasefire arrangement or others. And rallying allies requires skillful diplomacy and interest in the robustness of NATO that, you know, Trump may or may not necessarily demonstrate. He's also going to have to find some kind of way to reach out to others in the global south to bring them into this equation, which would require treating China as an equal, just as the United States will have to find some kind of way to shape Ukraine's strategic perspectives and perceptions and actions. China would be responsible in some respect of communicating with the Kremlin to restrain its actions. And I don't see the United States under any president right now, Trump or otherwise, being prepared to make the concessions to China necessary to build a more stable, equal relationship there, given the uncertainty of U.S.-China strategic competition going forward and who's going to have the upper hand. So whether it comes to the Ukraine war or in other regional conflicts, it requires a degree of U.S.-China comedy and desire to work together, which I don't currently see. Also domestically within the U.S., there were in Trump's first term, and there will be again, a huge number of people who simply will not view Trump as a legitimate president. And his ability to, get deals and legislation through Congress may be quite limited. And so if one aspect of restoring good relations with Russia is lifting economic sanctions, there's no guarantee, even if he wants to do that, that Congress is going to agree. So all in all, I think that the pieces are not necessarily there, because restoring relations with Russia really does require a degree of coherence in approach between both resolve and a degree of U.S. leadership in Europe, but also a degree of restraint and understanding and empathy for Russia's core strategic interests, and that very specific balance between those two things. And I just don't see Trump as being able to articulate that clearly at all.
Thank you. And I think one of the most insightful articles that I read recently about this as well is that if he did indeed become president again, he would have a very hard time actually forming a cabinet, because who would want to work with him after all that he has? All his predecessors ended up in having to fight for their lives to stay out of jail. Okay, so Ambassador Chali, Catherine Ashton highlighted that democracy remains our best method of giving power and control to the people. Every nation is an unfinished project on its democratic journey. How do you foresee the future of Ukraine, and how can it ensure a democracy given its very difficult neighborhood?
Look, I am very proud being in Switzerland to tell you that Ukraine is democracy, and we proved it 3 times with direct democracy mechanism like Switzerland. Orange Revolution, it was direct democracy. Revolution of Dignity, it was direct democracy. Defending the country after the Russian aggression, when everybody in the world were thinking we lost the war through 1 week, it was direct democracy when the Ukrainian people voluntarily go to front and defend country. So I'm sure we is and will be direct democracy and democratic country. Of course, we now in a very difficult situation because we fighting alone against one of the biggest nuclear state in the world, Russia. And but we was friends, with strategic friends, first of all with United States and EU, and with Ramstein group friends. And I'm sure we won this war. I think Putin wanted to decline Ukrainian statehood, to change Ukrainian political orientation, but Putin did not reach it, and I'm sure never in the future reach it. We won this war in the May last year, but now for us, for future sustainable democratic development of my country, the most important challenge to end this war. It's a challenge, and I ask you very sincerely to help us, and I'm sure our debates with some ideas, with some proposals, initiatives, I'm sure will help us all together to end this terrible war in the heart of the Europe and permit for Ukraine to rebuild my country on European values and on democratic values. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're running, the clock is ticking. So I'm going to lump all 3 of you. Graham, I'm cognizant, even though if I don't see you, I know you're there, that we had promised that we would talk about what it would need to initiate a ceasefire. What is some of the steps that we could take to create an environment conducive to peace talks? So I'd like to ask all 3 panelists that question. What are some confidence building measures that you think could be initiated now in order to initiate a ceasefire and create an environment that's conducive to peace talks? Or are we not even close to that moment?
Look, I totally disagree with you that it's possible to even plan or even dream about possible peace talks. I explain to you why. Concerning this ceasefire, I really think it's possible, but not as a final point in some de-escalation process. That firstly, we push forward mechanism of more trust, more confidence building measures, and then final point ceasefire. To my mind, ceasefire will be the peak of escalation of the war between Ukraine and Russia. And it will be, to my mind, de facto ceasefire. Look, Russians constructed line of Surovikin, defense line, yes? And a few days ago, President Zelensky adopted decree about construction Ukrainian defense line. So we now transfer our strategy and we start strategic defense. And to my mind, in the future, on the peak of escalation, it can create some grounds for de facto ceasefire. And after this, the diplomats can help to transfer this is de facto ceasefire in sustainable ceasefire under maybe some international legally binding security guarantees. So what I see in the future.
Thank you so much, and over to you, Zach.
I agree with very much, Alexander, with your earlier comment about the fact that the keys to a ceasefire lie not just in Kiev or in Moscow, but also very much in Washington and in other Western capitals. But I'm a little bit less optimistic about the prospects of a ceasefire or any serious negotiations as things currently stand, likely before early 2025. And that's because Russia, as of right now, having seen Ukraine's counteroffensive fail, thinks the time is on its side. And the West is simply not prepared to undertake the necessary conditions to bring the concessions, to bring Russia to the table, given Russia's current strategic perception of the status quo. Throw in 2 elections that are coming up, one in Russia and one in the United States, and it makes these discussions very, very difficult. The only way to overcome that dynamic is going to be a massive diplomatic effort on the part of the United States to, reaffirm commitment to allies, to reach out to countries in the global south, including but not limited to China, to sweeten the deal for Ukraine as much as possible with a very clear set of commitments concerning, what NATO's actual commitment to Ukraine is, more than just providing assistance in the event of a reinvasion, but short of Article 5, but that nonetheless clarifies that there aren't going to be any black holes anymore in the European security architecture. It is a Herculean feat that needs to be accomplished, and I don't see the political will for that right now, unfortunately. What we would need to do if we want to speed that timetable up is to find some kind of way to convince the Biden administration that the battlefield is going to be unpredictable over the next year or so. What looks like a stalemate today may not, in fact, be a stalemate, and could, just like in World War I, as Ambassador Greminger was saying at the beginning, what looked like a stalemate for a long time, one side's morale can break at some point, and significant gains can be made. A war is a very difficult thing to predict, and we shouldn't sort of take the status quo and look linearly into the future. And if we do hammer home this message that perhaps things are going to get much worse in unpredictable ways, then perhaps we could change the strategic calculation on that front, taking into account, pricing in as well, the extent to which it may be possible that we could see a diminution of Western support for Ukraine, although the degree of solidarity does remain strong at the political level. But that's the way I see things right now. I'm a little bit more pessimistic.
Sure, please go ahead. And then Graham, we haven't forgotten you.
Yes, it's a very small but very important statement. Ceasefire, in official perception of Ukraine, it's possible only on the borders 1991. But if ceasefire practically will be on another line, to my mind, it's very important to understand that ceasefire will have no linkage with territorial question. Because Ukraine never agreed, it's our principal position, and we defended this position in Istanbul communique, and Russia agreed. We never agreed to transfer, under any peaceful settlement, to transfer our sovereignty title over our territories within the borders of 1991 to Russia. So it's possible that some historical period of time, Crimea de facto will be under control of Russia. But we never agree to transfer sovereignty title over Crimea to Russians from Ukraine. And now Ukrainian territorial integrity are recognized by practically entire world. So it's a very principal question. Ceasefire possible, but changing of internationally recognized Ukrainian territory, it's impossible.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Graham.
Thank you. Yeah, really interesting discussion. I think number of stumbling blocks, even for a ceasefire, let alone any peace treaty or discussion, is Russia's position. So irrespective of whether Ukraine insists on 1991 statehood, logically, Russia's position should be, I'm not promoting this, but if Putin was very pragmatic and not hostage to history, would be to say, let's have a ceasefire on the line of contact right now. We'll uphold the ceasefire. We're putting forward Russia, the ceasefire. Look, it's Ukraine that are the aggressors here. They're refusing. This would be a propaganda coup in the global south and would help Russia reposition the narrative. At the same time, Russia can reconstitute its conventional combat capability, build up the cruise missiles for the inevitable moment when the ceasefire is broken, which it would then say, well, Ukraine breaks it, therefore we're having to reluctantly send the cruise missiles back into the cities and the grain silos, etc. But Putin won't even do that. It looks like what Putin would do for a ceasefire is to say, I want recognition of full administrative border control of the 4 oblasts, demilitarization of the rest of Ukraine, only UN and OSCE, despite what Lavrov has said about the efficacy of the OSCE monitors, no NATO tripwire troops, or, God forbid, the Kissinger plan, if you like, with regard to the German option or the South Korean option, which had 70,000 US troops stationed in South Korea, or even the Sinai option of international armed monitors in the Sinai. So for Russia, all of that is out. And at the same time, it would say, we still want 1997 NATO and written guarantees, obviously, of no NATO membership, therefore, for Ukraine. And I think those are preconditions even for a ceasefire, let alone a treaty. The problem for Ukraine is, as has been said, not just what the constitution says. Putin is ICC, criminally indicted. There's zero trust. And in Ukraine, unlike in Russia, society has a role. Zelensky can't buck societal, very strong opinion in opinion polling in Ukraine that shows society is still prepared to fight. And I think what I've noticed is in foreign affairs over the last year, we've had articles by Haas, Kupchan, Thomas Graham, Barry Posen, Samuel Charap, essentially presenting a false dilemma, I think. They're essentially saying, look, Ukraine's going to lose in the long term. Doesn't matter how much equipment you give it, doesn't matter how much money you give it or what type of equipment. The manpower shortages are there. It's positional stalemate. Russia has the troops. Russia has the time. Ukraine's going to lose. Therefore, we should be pressuring Ukraine into premature, perhaps, ceasefire that might lead to a peace agreement on Russian terms, but it's the best that Ukraine can hope for. The trouble with that is it doesn't really, it is a false dilemma because it doesn't look at the third way. And I think as Ambassador Chali mentioned, there is a third way, which is arming further Ukraine to matching equipment to the necessary tasks and empowering Ukraine to win. At the tactical level, that would be to defeat Russian attempts to regain the strategic initiative through artillery and firepower, increase Ukraine's capacity to exploit the strategic initiative by degrading or helping Ukraine to degrade Russian Federation logistics, which anyway are going to deteriorate badly through the winter. So tactical salami slicing. At the operational level, long-distance strikes using F-16s armed with high-precision bombs and missiles, mine clearing and patrolling the new grain corridor. And at the strategic level, essentially symbolic humiliation of the Russian Federation, particularly Putin, by targeting manpower shortages and protecting Ukrainian gas infrastructure through enhanced air defense. Russia's going to go after the gas infrastructure because Russian gas no longer goes through Ukraine. And I think all of this is possible. And it also, we're looking at longer term Ukrainian weaknesses. You know, what about longer term Russian weaknesses? Is this regime structured for, I think it's structured with battalion tactical group force structure for a 3-day war, but not for 640, 700 days, 800-day war. It's structured for a kleptocracy using Systema to essentially steal from the system, I think. And then the question is it no war, no Putin? The flip side of that is the Prigozhin revolt, for example, is that a symptom of an underlying dysfunctionality in Russia that the war creates simply because it's not structured for war? And how stable really is Russia over the longer term? And even Belarus is a game changer. You know, increased opposition in Belarus when 90% of Russian combat ground troops are in Ukraine changes the equation, is actually the best security guarantee for Ukraine. So I think this kind of third way, if you like, empowering Ukraine to win, is too premature, in my view, to talk about ceasefire leading to peace negotiation, because that ceasefire would be on Russian terms. And Ukraine really has agency here and has a right to self-defense. And we're also not looking at the downside costs of proliferation, of incentivizing further Russian attacks, and also of China measuring Western commitment to Ukraine, measuring it and translating it into what does that mean for Taiwan. So the horizontal escalation of conflict, in other words, is a factor. Thank you.
On that note, I would like to close this session. Their speakers will stay on for a little bit longer should you have any questions directly on a bilateral basis. Before I close, I would like to thank our speakers, Ambassador Alexander Chali, Dr. Graham Hurd online. Thank you so much, Dr. Zachary Pagan, for your important contributions to our event. I think we really covered a lot of ground in a very short amount of time. I hope you also enjoyed this session and learned from it. So I also like to thank all those who were instrumental in making this event possible. Thierry Tardon, who did all the preparation, Florian Gollet, who is our technology expert, and Pontus Wallston, our photographer. We look forward to welcoming you back to our Geneva security debates in the new year in 2024. In the meantime, I wish you all a peaceful, warm, and blessed holiday season. Thank you.